Welcome to the All Things DER podcast, brought to you by AEIC. In this podcast, we dig in, define, and discuss where the new energy economy is heading with electric industry leaders and explore all the ways that distributed energy resources can modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, welcome to All Things DER podcast. I am your host, Dr. Elizabeth Cook, and today's episode we have Bryan Wright, the founder and CEO of Elpis. Thank you so much for joining us today. I want to take the opportunity to allow yourself to tell our audience, what is Elpis and what are you guys up to over there?
Sure. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast, Dr. Cook. So I'll give a bit of background about myself and then I'll transition into Elpis. So I started in this space working at a company called Itron, and while working on their smart meter AMI technology platform, realized that essentially we were deploying edge computing at the premise, and it created vast amounts of data and enabled many opportunities. And so eventually I left Itron and then I founded Elpis. So just sort of diving into Elpis in this space, I think Elpis has a portfolio that's focused on the distribution network. And so we have solutions that deal with model validation, system planning, DER interconnection management, power optimizer, essentially operational grid management, and then a power analyzer, which is a load flow solution set. And so that's sort of an overview of the company and a bit about myself.
Awesome. And as some listeners may know, that's one of my passions is data and really the insights and the analytics that we can gain from really using the enormous amount of data that's now becoming available to us utilities. So this is the sweet spot that you are all sitting on, it seems like. Also, I am coming from a planning organization. So I would love to hear about, what do you foresee as really the opportunities or maybe even challenges that the industry that you're serving is what's happening, right? As we transition to this clean new energy at the grid edge.
That's a good question. As for challenges, I see one of the primary challenges is the adoption curve of different types of technology, specifically grid disrupting technologies. Those sorts of technologies, photovoltaics, batteries, the cost of entry is lower. And eventually I could see a watershed event occurring that could upend cost models if utilities are slow to move.
So more or less the idea of understanding your adoption curves as a utility and when to take action behind, how to prepare for and have the infrastructure and the technology available to manage that.
Yeah, more or less. Yeah.
Yeah. I would have to say, being here in Western PA and, that challenge of that forecast, right, of what are these new technologies and how will they be embraced is very different than, a utility in Arizona or California or Texas. So very true. We all need to be watching those adoption curves. One thing I think, I've taken away from hosting this podcast is the foundation and really the analytics that you spoke of and that capability is a no regrets, because not only will it prepare you for this disruptive technology, I think it'll just make us better prepared for or serve our current role, which is safe, reliable, affordable power. So that's why I think it's the mecca. We need it now and we need it for tomorrow. So let's get started. I guess so, like with the utilities that you're serving or the industry, what distributed energy resources have you seen that really has your capabilities and your software has been able to help support that adoption curve, be it in California or I don't know which customers you could speak to, but how has that taken off for you?
Yeah, so in terms of DER adoption, obviously photovoltaic systems, storage are really growing in terms of their marketplace presence. EV deployment, both on the residential side and on the commercial side, are also a high area of growth. And so utilities that we engage with are really primarily focused on EV readiness and trying to ensure that their system planning process is adopted to deal with the high amount of DER adoption and the growth in those areas, and ensuring that their planning process can account for and deal with and is prepared to sort of help them understand the investments for the future that they may need to make to adjust and adopt for that sort of disruptive grid environment?
So I clued in on the electric vehicle infrastructure. So when I think, I took on this role at AEIC as, a member of the DER subcommittee, our main focus was solar and how do we interconnect, how do we plan, then how do we operate too. And just over the last 2 years, the whole conversation has pivoted towards electric vehicle. And I'm just going to jump on that other word that you used in regards to planning. And so, for our audience, everything's happening so fast, and especially even for internal utility stakeholders as well as external, the awareness of the lift of work that's required of the utilities in regards to being able to have the models at their fingertips, the data and the accuracy of those models ready to go to run the thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of scenarios, is a space that we're all sitting in. We're going from 0 to 100. And so I actually just gave a lecture on transmission planning, which is very different because we've had the models and the real-time data and the accuracy of the information since the 70s, really, we've been building upon. And so we're almost like coming into this world where that requirement, this information to really be able to drive the insight of how to interconnect this adoption curve of EVs, which is load, as well as solar or distributed generation in general. So I guess for our audience, just a reflection, when we talk about distributed energy resources, it is that grid edge. Some may say disruptive technologies, but we need to have the models and the analytics to really be able to drive the decision of how to build out the grid to prepare for the future. And so I think, Bryan, some of the use cases and really the tools that you spoke of in your introduction really play a part in that planning world. So, do you have examples of how you kind of onboarded that and provided that value to your customers?
Yeah, so from a system planning perspective, one of the things our solutions set offers is a curated, aggregated capacity analysis framework. So we give our customers essentially time series based 8760. And so they could see capacity and aggregation curves across their asset class from substation to any structure on their infrastructure, any structure, basically. And they could see this from an hour by hour basis. And then we build a forecast on that. And the next part is that forecast is handed off to our power analyzer. And one of the interesting things about that from a system planning perspective is when you look at an area that has, say, for instance, high PV penetration, and you look at sort of a time series based load flow, for instance, you'll see a distinct curve for a structure that has essentially a high PV penetration versus a curve, and this is hour by hour, versus the curve that you would see for a structure that has high EV penetration, both, say, commercial. And so looking at that at a granular level and understanding from a load flow on an hour by hour basis, what's happening on your infrastructure really gives, say, the engineers and the planners the tools to plan and accommodate for the future. The other tool set we bring to bear is a mitigation modeling kit that essentially allows for, once you run our power analyzer, allows for our customers to see essentially what the output in terms of issues are, where you're over capacity, where you have conductor issues, where you're over voltage, where you're under voltage. And so it really allows for a planner to sort of plan out their mitigation and schedule the mitigation. And then essentially, even in our tool, you can then take whatever steps you want to solve for, upload those solutions or resolutions in our system, run it again, and see what happens. If it runs clean, now you have a plan, you have a clean process for planning out your infrastructure upgrades. And that's, I think, key for this sort of dynamic future infrastructure, or rather the way that things are trending, having the ability to look at things in a time series manner at high resolution is going to be key.
So just to kind of ground set all of the tools, like if as a system planner, I'm totally geeking out on all the tools that you're sharing. So from a historical perspective, utilities fundamentally only need to really understand what was the current and the voltage being pulled at their substation that went into the distribution grid. And that was due to the fact that the distribution circuits, all of the circuits that run through the streets and all the laterals that tap into the home, were a one-way power flow, very predictable load forecast. We wake up, we go to work, or some of us used to, come back home, go to bed. And so over, the years or decades, it was a very predictive forecast where it ranged only from the fact that we continue to use more and more energy. So we build the grid out more and more. So we could just run a quick back of the envelope calculation of, is our conductor that the electrons are being pulled through the substation breaker large enough, and are our transformers that serve the downstream devices in homes big enough? But now, because of the dynamic change in these grid edge technologies, such as the solar, any distributed generation that's maybe could be dispatchable or not, our electric vehicle charging, which is just a new load that we've never had to serve, at an expedited ramp up based on some of the forecasts we're seeing, that very predictable load curve starts to fluctuate. And like you said, we now have the analytics and the capability that if we can tap into the overall usage and study that, we can then understand what our customers need from that service point, which before we just understood they woke up, they go to work, go to bed. But now with charging their vehicles, electrification of the edge with more efficient heat pumps, that's more electrical load, as well as this now generation presence, your software and those modules allow the utility to have that increased accuracy to the models that they are now currently building rapidly to be able to serve our customers continuously. So I just have to say there's extreme value in bringing that to light and really educating not only the internal utility stakeholders that modeling the distribution system and running those analytics is new to everyone, but also the external folks that really want to know, well, you've been operating the grid for 140 years. Why do you suddenly need all this new analytics and technology? So that's one of the passions of why I do this podcast is to educate really the public and really the next workforce or generation of engineers to help solve these problems. So with all my rambles, I would just say, like, what do you see, as like an aha moment with some of the people that you worked with, or really that educational perspective that you've been able to provide with the insights that your software tools have been able to give to others?
Well, I think some of the aha moments are just continuing along with, say, our power analyzer, is some of the reliability aspects that are beneficial that can be sussed out. For instance, when you start looking at load and you run a power flow on load, you could start looking at other aspects like thermal impacts. And so you can start looking at thermal duct bank, and you could do a thermal duct bank analysis and looking at the heat buildup in vaults and start to determine, oh my goodness, we may have to deal with something like that, associated with sort of high PV penetration or EV load that might, create a grid reliability issue. And so there are lots of different ways of looking at this in terms of getting in front of problems. That's the whole key, is to try and get in front of problems and create a more resilient infrastructure. In terms of other aspects, I think that a lot of times people don't understand the power of data. And once they see what they can do and what's happening within their infrastructure, it really enables a different approach. And that different approach can lead to different thinking. It could lead to different investment strategies, different mitigation strategies. For instance, once you understand the impacts of DERs on your grid, you might decide to, from a utility perspective, invest more heavily in those assets and opposed to traditional sort of investments, say for peak management, say for instance, dealing with peak shaving, you might be able to get away with a large commercial DR deployment and opposed to a massive peaker plant deployment or something like that.
Let me know if I'm following. So from a planning perspective, what we've had to do based on the limited knowledge of what's outside the substation breaker is really build the grid for that peak moment, which is that one moment in the summer, or some grids are winter peaking, and you built the infrastructure robustly to serve that moment in time. But with this analytics and these capabilities that you're able to bring to the planner's purview, they can start deploying other technologies such as a battery energy storage system or something that's similar that you could, reduce the peak or create a pocket of energy only for that moment of time, and then you don't have to robustly build out the grid. So we call that a non-wired solution. So your tools can really bring that insight to make NWSs, is what we call them, an option. And especially since a lot of this technology is becoming economical and feasible, we can deploy battery energy storages as assets to the overall distribution grid to support this need for that peak planning. And so without your analytics and your capabilities and tools, that is not as tangible to say that planner and the planning of your projects for your utility. Again, I'm geeking out because that's something us planners need to have to really do our jobs in this new world that we're all defining every day. So, well, I think it's very exciting and I love the opportunity to talk about this. Is there any last words or maybe lessons learned for those that, that are looking to really capture the insight of this data and what the first steps could be to really kind of embrace and move through this journey that we're all on together?
I just, I don't necessarily have any last words. Obviously, I appreciate the platform. And I think initiatives like this bring awareness to technology solutions that can help utilities meet their decarbonization goals by incorporating DERs into the planning and infrastructure procurement cycle. And so also it helps smaller businesses like Elpis get awareness in the marketplace generally. We're a startup. We're bootstrapped, so we are founder funded. And so platforms like this enable us to get out into the marketplace and allow folks to know that we offer solutions that can help them meet their goals within this sector, be it goals related to grid resiliency, decarbonization goals, grid optimization goals. And so I just want to say I appreciate that.
Well, you're welcome. It's been a joy working with you guys. And I'm coming from the world of data analytics, through my doctorate work. And it's one thing, you just don't know what you don't know. And so having the faith and the flexibility and the capability to be agile and understand the bigger picture, data analytics is it's like a live organism, right? It only becomes more intelligent with more data. So you have to just get started and start to let it talk to you. And then you continue to build out those use cases and create that value and work that work stream back into the overall, typical business case plans. So it's been a joy, being on the journey with you guys. And I look forward to continue to build out these tools, not only for us, but for the industry. But with that, thank you and have a great day.
Thank you, Dr.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of All Things DER. Thanks for tuning in. We hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode soon. Until then, keep powering on.